The wonderful bronze medal. There is a commemorative certificate suitable for framing. You'll have to fight over whose office it gets in. And a check as the other symbol of the award, which I'm sure can go to good use in your organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
All right. Thank you.
I think you're on next.
All right. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, members of Promoting Enduring Peace. Indeed, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for this great honor that you have bestowed upon me, upon my friend, Rabbi Ascherman, and all our colleagues, members of Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel. We are proud and humbled to receive this prestigious award and to join this most outstanding list of distinguished people, past recipients of this award. Today's ceremony falls on a date which is very significant in both the civil calendar as well as the Jewish calendar. Today is May Day, a day that symbolizes solidarity with the workers and standing for their rights. But according to the Jewish calendar, today is also the eve of Yom HaShoah, the Remembrance Day, the annual memorial day for 6 million Jews who died during the Holocaust. I am a second generation. My father is a Holocaust survivor. His entire family was murdered in Auschwitz. So for me, particularly, this day is very significant, and to receive on this very day the Gandhi Peace Award makes it even more unique and moving. Being a second generation, what is the lesson that I, the son of a survivor, take from this tragic history? I think the most important lesson that we should all take from the Shoah may be summed up with the famous words of never again. However, the lesson of never again is twofold. Yes, firstly, there is the never again that says never again Jews will be led to slaughter without being able to defend themselves. Yes, this is true, and that is why I proudly served as a paratrooper in the Israeli Defense Forces and continued to serve until the age of 45 when I was released from my reserve duty. But there is another meaning for never again. Not a particular one, but rather a universal one, which is no less important and perhaps today even more important. And that is, never again will people, any people, suffer from persecution, oppression, humiliation, dehumanization, and denial of their basic rights. Friends, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting in any way that there is any comparison between the Shoah and the situation between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East. What I am suggesting, however, is that no one is immune against racism and xenophobia. And therefore, we need to be constantly on guard lest anyone, including ourselves, fall into the deadly trap of bigotry and hate. That is why Rabbi David Foreman, the one who really should have stand here today, decided back in 1988 to establish the Rabbinic Human Rights Watch, later known as Rabbis for Human Rights. Unfortunately, David passed away exactly 1 year ago, and so it is me, a co-founder of our organization and its first executive director, who humbly stand before you today. Let me say a few words about the early days of Rabbis for Human Rights. 1988, the year Rabbis for Human Rights was founded, was the year of the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising in the territories. For me personally, it was a very significant year in my life. It was the year I was ordained as a rabbi. But in addition, it was the year that I was called for nearly 60 days of reserve duty in the refugee camp in Khan Yunis, in the Gaza Strip. And for me, it was an eye-opening experience. It was the first time that I saw from close the life conditions in the refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. During my regular service as a paratrooper, I had many opportunities to be in the occupied territories, in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip, but it was always on the main roads. Only during the first Intifada, when we had to chase after little children throwing stones at us into the narrow alleys of the refugee camps and into their homes, that I received a new perspective. While upon my return back to my home, I felt that I need to do something as a Jew, as a rabbi, to try to change things, to show the concern for human rights and to the sanctity of human life from a religious Jewish perspective. 1988 was also a year of a big controversy over the validity of non-Orthodox conversions in Israel. I, as a conservative rabbi, Rabbi David Foreman is a Reform rabbi, and some of our Orthodox colleagues, Rabbi David Rosen, Rabbi Max Warszawski of blessed memory, we all had vested interest in this topic. Yet we all agreed that there is even more important question at stake. And that is not who is a Jew, but rather what is a Jew and how therefore is a Jew to behave. Yesterday we read in the synagogue the weekly Torah portion from Leviticus 19. Kedoshim, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. In this Torah portion, in this biblical chapter, we find the famous words, love your neighbor as yourself. But not only that, we also read there, and if a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. But the stranger who dwells with you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Time and again, the Torah reminds us not to wrong the strangers, not to oppress them. You know the soul of the strangers, says the Torah, being yourselves strangers in the land of Egypt. We, who suffered for 2,000 years from persecutions and humiliation and oppression, should be sensitive more than anyone else to the suffering of others. What is the essence of Judaism? When Hillel the Elder, in the first century Common Era, was asked to sum up the Jewish teaching while standing on one foot, In a nutshell, he said, what is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Or to put it in a positive way, treat others the way you would like to be treated by them. This is the message of Rabbis for Human Rights. Every human being is created in God's image, and we must respect that image and try to see God in the face of our neighbor, in the face of the other. How shall we promote an enduring peace? By seeing all of us as members of one family, as children of one Father, to see every human being as a brother or sister. By walking in the footsteps of our common father Abraham, who was the model for justice and righteousness and the pursuit of peace. The book of Genesis tells us there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And Abraham said to his nephew Lot, let there be no strife between me and you, and between my herdmen and your herdmen, for we are brothers. Isn't the whole land before you? Please separate yourself from me. If you go to the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right hand, then I will go to the left. Two conflicting values are found here. One, the love of the land that was promised to Abraham, not to Lot, on the one hand, and the pursuit of peace on the other hand. For the sake of peace, Abraham is willing to give up parts of the land that was given and promised to him and to his seeds. Before I introduce to you my friend and colleague, Rabbi Ascherman, let me conclude with a wonderful poem by the late Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai called Tourists. Once I sat on the step by a gate at David's tower. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the basket? Just right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period. Just right off his head. Oh, but he's moving. I said to myself, redemption will come only if their guide tells them, you see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who's bought fruit and vegetables for his family. I pray for the day when we all come to recognize that the man who brought fruit and vegetables is more important than Roman arches, that human lives are more important than marble and stone, shrines and temples, that Adam, a human being, is more important than Adama, land. Bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad ushmo echad. On that day, the Lord shall be one, and his name one. And it is now my privilege and honor to introduce to you the General Secretary of Rabbis for Human Rights, my friend, Rabbi Arik Ascherman.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about what Rabbis for Human Rights is today, and then as I've been reflecting upon this award, I had 2 questions in my mind, one of which James partially helped me out. I thought we were a little bit of imposters here because we're not a pacifist organization, and so how could we get the Gandhi Award? And although it was explained a few minutes ago that you don't have to be a pacifist to receive the award, I do want to say a few words about what I think is the connection between our approach and our approach to nonviolence and achieving peace. And the other is, we're not a peace organization. We are a human rights organization, and those things are related but different. And I also want to perhaps reflect a little bit on the relationship between human rights and peace. I think that's also been alluded to a few times already, but to say a few words about that. As I scheduled this trip to be here so that Rabbi Bandel and I could receive this award, and then doing some other speaking around the country, what was important to me, and it was all scheduled so that I would be home for Yom Ha'atzmaut, for our Israeli Independence Day, which will take place starting next week from Monday evening the 9th. A few years ago, this is now, I guess, our 63rd anniversary, but on the occasion of our 60th anniversary, this was a time of huge celebration for us as Israelis. And yet, of course, we know that as much as this is a time for us for celebration, for others, it's the Nakba. It is a time, the disaster. And I think, as I'll explain in a few minutes, our work on behalf of Palestinians is only one piece of what we do in Rabbis for Human Rights, a very important piece, of course. But when I think about that piece, at least of what we do, I would say that perhaps our ultimate goal is to bring a little bit closer to fruition that promise that God makes time after time in the book of Genesis, that through you shall all the peoples of the world be blessed, all the families of the world be blessed. That if today we are in a situation where what's a blessing for us is a curse for somebody else, we want to bring about a reality, a different reality than today's reality, in which what is a blessing for us is a blessing for others and for everybody as well. It seems difficult, but we've just, of course, celebrated in the Jewish tradition our holiday of Passover. In Passover, we learn of the God, what Rabbi Michael Lerner has said, the God of endless possibilities, that we do not have to accept the current reality as being our fate forever, that you do not have to accept being slaves. That what seems like an eternal and unalterable situation is not an unalterable and eternal situation, because the God of liberation, the God of freedom, the God of endless possibilities says that there can always, and we can together as partners with God, bring about a different reality. So, on the occasion of Israel's 60th anniversary, we issued a series of radio ads. There were two different radio ads, each starting with a piece of the original recording of our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, reading out, as he did 63 years ago, Israel's Declaration of Independence. And in the first of these series of two ads, you hear him say that the country will be mushtetet, the very fountainhead, the basis of its inspiration, of its existence, will be cherut, tzedek, v'shalom, l'or chazonam shel Nevi Yisrael, freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. And in the second, you hear him say that the country will guarantee total, and you hear him emphasize the word total, social and political equality for all, regardless of religion, nationality, or gender. And our ads went on to say, we had this dream 60 years ago. We had this vision of the country that we were trying to create. We had these commitments that we made to ourselves and to others about who we wanted to be. Where have we succeeded, and where have we not yet succeeded? Not where we've failed. 60 years is not a long time as countries go, but where have we not yet succeeded? And when And we've created one of our main departments in Israel is our educational department. We've created, we run educational programs for the Army, for youth taking off a year between high school and the Army, for university students, and we've created, to do this, among other things, a Talmudic-style commentary on Israel's Declaration of Independence. It's also been used in an English version here in the United States by many congregations. And when I teach from that, sometimes I feel a sadness pass through the room. Because when we're honest, we have to say to ourselves, we haven't yet done what we set out to do, what we thought we were doing, what we wanted to do. But some of you may be asking, well, what did the prophets have to say about freedom, justice, and peace? As was mentioned, quoted earlier, I think by Reverend Olson, we love to quote from Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares. We like to forget about Prophet Joel, who talked about beating plowshares into swords. And if Rabbi Bandel has just mentioned Parshat Kiddushim, the weekly Torah portion that in our annual cycle we read just yesterday, I want to share you another story. A few years ago, one of our most significant victories in the occupied territories is that for some 10 years now, we've been doing two things. We've been replanting olive trees that have been uprooted or by the army, by settlers, as we saw in that film, or in areas in danger of expropriation, such as between the separation barrier and the Green Line, the 67 border. By the way, you should know that that film, that the video you saw, was on land between Awarta and Itamar. And some of you may know, of course, have heard of this terrible murder of a family in their sleep in the settlement of Itamar. And of course, whatever may we think about those settlements, murders like those are just abominable. And yet, when you see that film, that video, you understand that it is part of an ongoing cycle, unfortunately, of violence in that region in which both Israelis and Palestinians have been murdered. And of course, it brings to mind one of the sayings that we learn in Pirkei Avot, that the sword comes into the world because of justice delayed and justice denied. It doesn't justify violence. But if we really are committed to ending violence, then we must, as has already been said, commit ourselves to justice. But the good news is that if back in 2002, Palestinians and those of us who we were trying to protect by sending out our volunteers as human shields in a place like between Awarta and Itamar, so that to prevent Palestinian farmers from being attacked by violent settlers, and they're not all violent, but some of them are. The good news is that after engaging the security forces and sitting down and talking with them about what the responsibilities had to be, and then eventually going to Israel's High Court, we won a major victory in 2006 in which the Israeli Supreme Court said the army must do more than it's been doing up until now to make sure that Palestinians get to every single olive tree that they own, and that the army and police must protect them when they do so. So that today, there are many Palestinians getting to their lands that they had not been able to get to for some 2, 5, 10, even 15 years. And instead of my volunteers getting their heads cracked open, trying to be human shields, it's now often the Israeli army that has that pleasure. So on one day, a few years ago, I get a phone call from two villages, from El Buwaib and Bani Naim in the southern Hebron Hills. And they said that for many weeks they've been trying to get to the lands, and every time they try to do so, they get chased away by settlers, often backed by the army. So the first thing I did is I called up the army, and they had to, of course, acknowledge that according to the conditions of this high court victory, they had to allow these people to get to their lands. The people wanted to go the next day. It was too late to to get the army to be there. And so we were there. The farmers actually did not show up. They were still a little bit scared, but the shepherds showed up. And soon after that, the settlers, and they start trying to chase away the flocks, and they're shooing one way, and we're shooing the other way, and we're just going on and on and on, and drifting farther from where we started. And then I get a phone call. I don't know what we used to do before we had cell phones. I had two middle-aged women that were out volunteering with me that day. They said, you've got to come back quickly. There's a settler here on the rampage. He's attacking. He's busting cameras. I get back as quickly as I can. And I see this man on top of one of our volunteers. I draw him towards me. That, by the way, is the real test of nonviolence. Okay? And this guy was about half my size. He starts attacking me with a baton, slapping me, cursing. I could have taken care of him, but the commitment was to nonviolence. And the other interesting thing was at one point he says, I actually know you. We grew up in the same youth movement together back in the United States. And someone said to me afterwards, actually Rabbi Foreman's wife, that's one more educational failure of our youth movement. Nevertheless, this man is swearing, threatening to kill my family. He says, I know where you live. He's trying to beat me with a baton. I'm trying to keep him from the one remaining camera because he's saying, I busted all the cameras. No one will ever know what happened here today. When finally the police we called and the army arrived, we're back in the police station. And this man, who also turns out he's a rabbi, is teaching words of Torah to the police officers. They got their mouths hanging open. They're hanging on every word. At one point, though, he says, I really don't believe in secular law, only religious Torah law. So this was a Friday, and the next day on the Jewish Sabbath, we were in synagogue listening to the Torah being read, and the portion was Kiddushim. And I'm sitting there listening to the Torah being read and thinking about this man who had been on a rampage the previous day, who was so insistent that he was so adherent to the Torah, and thinking about all the mitzvot, all the Jewish commandments from that one Torah portion alone that had been violated the previous day. What about v'hadarta pnei zaken, to honor the elderly, as he'd thrown violently one elderly Palestinian man, Abu Rafi, to the ground? What about loving your neighbor, as was mentioned, loving the stranger? And how about the prohibition against telling falsehoods? And there have been plenty of falsehoods told at that police station. And do not stand idly by while your neighbor bleeds. I had begged his fellow settlers to restrain their friend, and they stood idly by. The point is that in Israel today, I think through most of the world, but certainly in Israel and the Middle East, religion is such a powerful force, and we must fight for the soul of our religion. I cannot say to you, we have the only correct understanding of Judaism. Our tradition is too ancient and multi-layered and based on debate to say that about almost anything. I think perhaps with the exception of that ultimate value of the human being. But in such a situation, if our first mandate in Rabbis for Human Rights is to try to prevent or redress human abuses, then our second and no less important mandate is to try to introduce into the intellectual universe of our fellow Israelis that alongside this increasingly dominant understanding of Jewish tradition by both the religious and non-religious in Israel alike, a very problematic and dangerous mixture of extreme nationalism and extreme particularism. Particularism meaning that of all the wonderful values we have in the Jewish tradition about how we treat our fellow human beings, what we call mitzvot ben adam lechavaro, that they're only applicable to our fellow Jews, maybe not even to all Jews, only our own insular community within the wider Jewish community. And so I think that today, And I don't think it's just Israel. And I don't think it's just Judaism. I think it's in our world today. But in the Jewish context, I will say that of all those debates and all those divisions, and we Jews love to debate and discuss, perhaps the most salient and most important of those divisions and debates today is between those who think that all those wonderful commandments we have about how we treat our fellow human beings are for Jews only or our own particular Jewish community, and those of us who it's already been said when we read in those first verses of Genesis that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. It doesn't say just the Jews. It doesn't say just the rich. And it makes a point of saying both men and women. To do that, to exemplify by our actions that we believe that every human being is created in God's image, it is essential that we, through our deeds, promote and protect the human rights of every human being. That's why, on principle, in Rabbis for Human Rights, we are always involved in at least one issue dealing with the human rights of Jewish Israelis, and at least one issue dealing with the human rights of non-Jews who are part of our society. And we work on many issues but perhaps the pillars of our work are education about Judaism and human rights, Israeli Arabs or Israeli Palestinians, those who are citizens of the state, but for example, those in the unrecognized villages. You can see a picture of Rabbi Bandel and myself meeting with the sheikh from El Arik just a few months ago, an unrecognized village, a village which isn't on the Israeli map, and therefore gets no services and has been demolished some 22 times since last July as several JNF forests close in with the ultimate goal of having a forest where once people used to live. We believe that economic justice is a human right. What you may not know, and we certainly all know about the terrible conditions that many Palestinians live in, that inside Israel, some 20% of the Israeli elderly are chronically hungry, choosing every day between medicine and food. Somewhere between 25% of Israeli youth and children go to bed hungry at least one night a week. Somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of Israelis are under the poverty line. And for us, the Israeli single-parent mom opening up the empty refrigerator is every bit the human rights issue as those Palestinian farmers. And one of our major victories in this last year, some people say one of the most significant human rights or social justice victories in Israel in recent memory, was defeating the so-called Israeli Wisconsin Plan. A wonderful idea to get people off welfare and into the workforce, but done through a carrot and stick approach where you get your benefits cut if you don't cooperate. And just as the Wisconsin Plan in Wisconsin a few years ago, what it ultimately does, almost everywhere it's been tried, according to studies around the world, is increase poverty, increase suffering, destroy the social net of the weakest people in our society. And this taught me a few things. Just two stories. Rabbis, we love to tell stories. We've got plenty of them. But just two here. A few years ago, a woman comes into our office to say thank you. A young, healthy-looking woman. Looks like she should be out working. She had a difficult to diagnose mild retardation. She could not hold down a job. But because this program is based on what we call in Jewish parlance, Lashon Hara, the assumption was judging always these people the unemployed people negatively, that the program was set up not to fight unemployment, but to fight the unemployed. And so the assumption was that this was one more welfare queen driving a Cadillac or something like this, and that it was her fault, and nobody believed in this woman. Legal aid would not take the case. Her own family wanted to throw her out of the house. They didn't believe her either. Said, "You're not pulling your weight." We were the only people that believed in this woman, and it took us 2 years an unprecedented 4 appeals, but we eventually won. We got this woman's benefits back and maybe a little bit of her dignity back. And she came in to say thank you. Was it worth it? If we had sat back to do some logical cost-benefit analysis, would it have been a wise use of our resources to spend so much effort on what seemed clearly an impossible case to win? No, it wouldn't. But justice is not always achieved, or it may be ever achieved, through logical cost-benefit analysis. It's done olive by olive, unemployed person by unemployed person. And it reminds us of what we are taught in the Talmud, that one who saves a single life, it is if one has saved an entire world. As we were fighting what we do best, both in the olive groves and in a place like Hadera, where we had this center to help the unemployed Israelis, we always have one foot in the grassroots and the other in the corridors of power. And we were coming up on a crucial vote in the Knesset, in our parliament. It looked like we were goners because the for-profit companies that were making money off of this were pulling at all the stops and lobbying. And I said, we had an empowerment group of women in the program. I said, we have to bring them to lobby. And people said to my staff, nah, not a good idea. Knesset's a nasty place, and it is. Sometimes I think it's more dangerous to be in the Knesset than in the West Bank. But I said, it's now or never, because if we don't do it now, there isn't going to be a tomorrow. And I sat with the women, I said, nobody will think poorly of you if you decide you're not ready for this. But as Mordecai says to Esther, in the book of Esther in the Bible, maybe just for this moment you're here. And I said to them, you're going to go in there and there's going to be people that think you're dirt, that don't want to listen to what you have to say, that aren't going to respect you, and even if they do, they're going to be bound by coalition agreements and they can't change their votes in any case. And you're going to have one thing and one thing only in your favor, and that's the truth in your hearts. And you have to find a way so that truth in your heart reaches out and communicates to the truth, to the hearts of the people that you're trying to speak to, those members of Knesset. And they did it. They did it. We won the vote. We eventually defeated the plan. But what's really amazing is that the woman who got up and the member of Knesset who most vehemently argued against that plan was Orly Levy. She's a member of Avigdor Lieberman's racist Yisrael Beitenu party, the one that used to talk about transferring Arabs out of the country and now just talks about loyalty oaths and these kinds of things. To argue against the program, she repeated and recounted word for word the personal story of an Israeli Arab woman from our empowerment group that she'd met just an hour before. If anybody had told me that someone from Yisrael Beitenu would identify with and retell with such passion the story of an Israeli Arab woman, I would have said, what are you smoking, okay? Not possible. What I learned from this is that you never write anybody off. You never forget what our Jewish tradition teaches about every human being's possibility to do tshuva, to change, to answer an inner call, to turn around and return to our truest and highest selves. And you never discount the possibility of the power of the truth that we have in our heart to reach out to the hearts of others. Of course, what we're most famous or infamous for is the work that we do in the occupied territories. And as I suggested, and has been mentioned, we work to prevent demolitions of homes, to protect Palestinians in East Jerusalem, in the occupied territories, as well as in Israel proper. We also work sometimes through the courts, sometimes through field work like setting out those volunteers as human shields, sometimes lobbying the Knesset and the government, sometimes through working with the international community, and when all else fails, through acts of civil disobedience. Israel is a very strong democracy. Internally, the occupation is another matter. But internally, we have a very strong democracy. There is racism. There is discrimination, as you find in any democracy in the world. But of course, in a democracy, you have to be careful. You cannot simply go out and do civil disobedience every time you disagree with something, because that would be chaos. But as one of our role models, and if Rabbi Bandel Kfar already mentioned our founder, who we so much wish could be here today, Rabbi David Foreman, to found the organization, he wrote an open letter saying, why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned with Sabbath observance and kashrut, or Jewish dietary laws? Where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels running around this country and crying Gewalt and speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society? Rabbi Heschel, descendant of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent most of his career teaching, writing wonderful books about Judaism, Jewish philosophy, poetry, biographies, but he didn't just stay in the ivory tower. He's one of the first people to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He's one of the people behind the scenes that led to the Nostra Aetate, the clauses in Vatican II bringing rapprochement between Catholic and Jewish communities worldwide. He was very active in opposing the Vietnam War, and his picture hangs on our wall, marching with Martin Luther King. He's our role model, and if we had a song about crossing the bridge, he was there, Rabbi Heschel. And that brought our organization together. But Rabbi Heschel said something else, our role model. He said, in a democracy, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. And so, seeing that bulldozer tearing into that home to demolish it, for no other reason than there was an intentional manipulation of zoning laws to prevent them from getting a permit. The father clutching at his heart as he's about to have a heart attack. The women tearing at their hair, pleading with us to do something. And knowing that the worst is yet to come, the moment I would not wish on my worst enemies. And that's the moment the children come home. They went off in the morning to school, and they had a home, and now there's rubble, and they're looking for a book or a toy. And I've seen so many times that demolishing a home doesn't just demolish a building, it demolishes a family. The marital tensions, the straight-A students whose grades plummet, the older children who wet their beds at night rather than leave them because they're so panic-stricken, who don't believe in their parents anymore, who weren't able to protect them. There comes a certain point, seeing that Torah, which we as rabbis are sworn to uphold, being ground into the rubble along with that home, and that image of God, that Sedem Elokim, that we're all commanded to honor, being banished from that place, there comes a certain point where one has no choice, really, but to stand in front of the bulldozers. Usually these things are closed, the case is closed after a year. In this case, I was put on trial. There were some amazing moments, the fact, and you can see in some of the literature outside, a letter signed by over 400 rabbis from around the world on the home demolition issue sent to the Prime Minister. And the fact that it turned out that the day that I would take the stand on my own behalf fell between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, one of the holiest times in our Jewish calendar. And as I told the judge, from the moment I knew that this would be the day that I would take the stand, what kept on ringing through my head are those words we say just before that Kol Nidrei prayer, that most famous of prayers, just that we say on the evening of Kol Nidrei, of Yom Kippur, where we say, B'yeshiva shemala, v'yeshiva shemata, in the heavenly court above and the earthly court below, we can all pray together on this most holy of eves. And I said to the judge, a few days it's going to be Yom Kippur. We believe the entire world is being judged, and therefore we beseech of God in that heavenly court, in the Yeshiva Shemala, to not judge us and the entire world from the throne of strict justice, but to move and judge us from the throne of mercy and compassion. How can we ask that of God in the Yeshiva Shemala, if in the Yeshivot Shemata, if in the earthly courts and institutions in which we are responsible both for justice and for mercy, if we do not do the same? And I reminded the judge that in the original Hebrew, justice and law are synonyms, tzedakah u'mishpat. Unfortunately, in our world, that's not always the case. So I had the prosecuting attorney in tears that day, but the judge remained rather aloof. She was the one that counted. We were convicted and then unconvicted by the prosecution, who said these are actually upstanding citizens. They should have the expungement of the conviction for community service. Everyone thought I should do community service by rebuilding homes. The court didn't go for that either. But having not received justice in a court of law, we went and laid the cornerstone for a new building. We eventually rebuilt that building. We gave it, and for a year, you could have seen the housewarming gift that we brought: a vine and a grapevine and a fig tree, of course, in the words of the prophet Micah, and everybody should sit under the vine and under the fig tree, and none should make them afraid. What we want for every human being, that no Israeli should live in fear of terror, and no Palestinian should live in fear of having their homes arbitrarily demolished. It was demolished again, we've rebuilt it again, and now, of course, we're not just trying to do the Sisyphean effort of defending one home, but we're working with our legal team to undermine and challenge the very legal basis of the whole policy. If we've had some successes, sometimes when we're out there in the olive groves, I meet angry and resentful soldiers. Why has my commander told me this day that my job is to protect Palestinians? Who knows who among them has lost a loved one or an army buddy in a terror attack? And they're saying, I have to go protect their human rights? That's emotionally impossible to ask of anybody, and you can think of the parallels from the Palestinian side. But that's what you've got to do. Again in the Bible, where you may remember the story of Hagar and Ishmael, banished into the desert, dying of thirst until God prepares a well for them. But according to the Midrash, the rabbinic commentary written almost 2,000 years ago, before God prepares the well, the angels come to God and say, what are you doing? Don't you know that sorrows, the trouble that the children of Israel are going to suffer from the children of Ishmael throughout history? Let them die. Just end it right here. God says no. God knows that no future is inevitable and says, Basher Husham, right now in front of me is an innocent child. And we too, who are created in God's image, we too must distinguish between that terrorist coming to murder my children, and bombs have gone off not far from my home, and that family that simply wants to put a roof over their heads or harvest their olives. So now before I finish, I'd like to address those two questions. What about and what happens to nonviolent principles in a not so nice neighborhood where we do have people that would like to destroy us if they could? I often do a little exercise with Israelis. Every single Israeli school child can quote from the Talmud where we're taught, if someone's coming to kill you, you get up earlier and you kill them first. We're not a pacifist religion. We believe that we have a right and responsibility to defend ourselves. But then I ask people, well, how the Talmud continues. I get blank stares because we're taught just right after that about someone chasing after a knife with someone after a knife to kill them, somebody else. The Talmud says you must kill the pursuer, not only to save the person being pursued, but to save the pursuer from him or herself. But we're taught, if you could have stopped that person by any other means, if you could have shot them in the foot, if you could have shouted, and you killed them, even though you were simply trying to do the right thing, you were trying to save a human life, it says that you're guilty of murder. There's a doctrine of minimum necessary force. And then the stakes get even higher. Because we're taught about the man who comes to Rabbah, one of the same Talmudic rabbis that a few pages earlier said, if someone's coming to kill you, you get up earlier and you kill them first. But now the question is, the strong man in my village is going to come kill me if I don't go kill this innocent third person. What should I do? Rabbah would have had no problem had the question been, can I defend myself against the person coming to murder me? But regarding the innocent third person, he says, let yourself be killed rather than kill. Who is to say that your blood is redder than his? And so what we learn is that even as we do have a right and even a responsibility to defend ourselves, and sometimes in difficult situations, rockets being rained down on Sderot, it seems you have, even there, you have to search for the way, wherever possible, to use minimum necessary force, to avoid harming civilians, and not simply take that right that we have to defend ourselves as carte blanche to harm other innocent human beings. And if we heard at the outset, quote from Jesus about loving our enemy, I'm sure that Jesus also knew, as a rabbi, what we're also taught in Pirkei Avot, the Rabbi Natan, another one of our guiding principles. Who is truly mighty? The one who turns an enemy into a friend. It's not that we don't have enemies. It's not that we're naive. But we're always looking for the way, using that ability, that spiritual power that we have to see God's image in every human being, even those we have conflict with, to always be looking for the way of saying, today's reality is not inevitable, and we can find a way of turning enemies into friends. And finally, why would you give a peace award to a human rights organization? Back in the beginning years of Rabbis for Human Rights, and when Rabbi Bandel was also on the board of one of our fellow human rights organizations, B'Tselem, there was a debate between a well-known left-wing politician, Yossi Sarid, and B'Tselem, because in those heady days after Oslo, everyone said, and even he said, if we have to cut some human rights corners to achieve peace, which is just around the corner and which will also improve the human rights situation, then so be it. He wouldn't say that today. And that's not understanding the connection between the micro and the macro. My homiletics professor in rabbinical school used to say the most trenchant criticism I can give you is to say that your sermon is nice, because nice means not so important. Human rights for many are nice. And in the Cold War era, that was the founding era for PEP, both sides love to use human rights to bash the other guy over the head with, but not looking at their own record. But they're not important. And the real brass ring, everybody said, was the peace process, was the peace agreement. But that was not understanding the connection between micro and macro. When the second Intifada broke out, there was a debate between Israel's two major military intelligence agencies. Some people may say military intelligence is an oxymoron, but the Amman said, what we've all heard, that Yasser Arafat didn't get what he wanted at Camp David, came home and he planned an Intifada. The Shabak said, no, this was spontaneous. And those of us working in the field didn't need to hear this because we were predicting the second Intifada a year and a half before it happened. Predicting isn't justifying. It'll be recorded as a disaster both for Israelis and Palestinians. But we knew it was going to come, or we strongly suspected, because in the same way that Israelis became disillusioned with the peace process when during the Oslo years the Palestinian Authority was unwilling or unable to stop terror, average Palestinians saw the ongoing human rights violations at the same pace after Oslo as before Oslo, expropriation of land, home demolitions, tree uprootings, and what have you. And they said, this is not a peace process. And that left Palestinians saying, we have nothing to lose. There's nothing in this for us. And that made Palestinian society ripe for Intifada. And so today, as we see dangerous signs that we could be close to a third Intifada, we will remember those words of Martin Luther King, which were said earlier, that that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it does come down to hope. And I think hope is the other thing that we provide as a human rights organization that eventually contributes to peace. I don't know how many times when I've gone to rebuild a demolished home that Palestinian parents have insisted that they meet with us. Like deja vu, saying our 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. He's just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. We want our child to meet you because we want him to understand that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes, that there are Israelis who come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Why is it that we correctly get upset when we hear about propaganda being taught in Palestinian schools about Israelis? It's because we know that even if we teach if we sign the perfect peace treaty tomorrow, if we continue to teach hate about each other, that treaty is not going to last. And when we're either going to live together or we're going to die together because there is no military solution, and it's kind of like a Greek tragedy. How many more people will die before we get to where we all know we have to get to? Who is really doing more for Israel's long-term security and certainly for peace? The people that demolish homes and uproot trees and steal land and violate human rights, or those who rebuild homes and restore land to the rightful owners and return and help replant the trees and pick the olives? Yes, what we believe that we're doing is a just and right and Jewish thing to do. But if you want to be really honest about it, it's also the best thing I can do for the physical survival of my children. The real Zionism today is working for an Israel which is both physically strong and morally strong and lives up to our highest Jewish values. And it's the only way that we're going to survive, because without peace, we are all doomed. And the only way to bring about peace is through bringing about justice. And only let me say, opinion polls show consistently that there's a sane majority of Israelis and Palestinians who want a compromise negotiated agreement, but a larger percentage on both sides that say we want peace, they don't. So why move forward for peace when you don't think there's anyone to reciprocate? Only we, as Israelis, particularly religious Israelis, because the most deeply held stereotypes that Palestinians have about Israelis is about religious Israelis, and we're all violent, fanatic settlers. Only we can break down the stereotypes of Palestinians that they have about Israelis, thereby empowering Palestinian peacemakers to be heard by their own people. Only Palestinians can empower us. There has to be a coalition of hope. Only by working together can we break down the stereotypes that we all hold and move forward towards peace. April 15th, 2004, tax day in America. I'm in the village of Beit Suik, one of the villages that eventually won a high court appeal against the routed separation barrier. At the end of this demonstration, I get a call to come to another neighborhood because a 13-year-old boy has been caught by the border police. He's being beaten. I and two Israelis start making our way to where this is happening. The border police start shooting tear gas. The other two go back. I'm the only one stupid enough to keep on going forward. And at the end, I get there. The commander beckons me forward, grabs me by the throat, shakes me violently, starts headbutts me, starts screaming, "You're arrested." I knew very well. I didn't know why I was arrested, but I knew I was arrested. I see this boy strapped, as you can see a picture in our materials, to the windshield of the Jeep, shivering in fear, unsuccessfully trying to hold back the tears. The Palestinian youth, I'm put in a handcuff next to it, and also in front of a Jeep. The Palestinian youth who could have decided not to throw stones at their own start throwing, hitting the Jeeps we're forced to be in front of, and were used for the next couple hours as human shields. I tell this story, first of all, the pictures appeared around the world. We're not shy about working with the press, but I got uneasy because I felt reporters were obsessing on this. I said, as terrible as this is, it's not like it only could happen in Israel. 2 weeks after that, the first revelations about Abu Ghraib came out. Wherever people put on uniform, they all too often feel it gives them the permission to violate the very laws they're sworn to uphold. As someone who gives every waking hour just about to fighting Israeli injustice, up against double standards, Israel should not be held to a higher standard, nor should it be coddled. But the second reason that I conclude with this story is because who knows what psychological scars that young boy will have for the rest of his life. He was waking up with nightmares for at least a month every night afterwards. Who knows what he's thinking about all Israelis, maybe all Jews. But when he gave an affidavit to our fellow human rights organization, B'Tselem, after describing all the horrific things that happened to him, he concluded by saying, and then a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue and told me not to be afraid. The work that we do is not fun. As I said before, not as an Israeli, not as a Jew, not as a rabbi, not as a Zionist. There's no great pleasure in dealing with the deepest, darkest corners of the country that I love, day in and day out. It has its dangers. I've been attacked by settlers. I've been, as was mentioned in the video, by the security forces and by Palestinians alike. But I'll do it again and again for that young boy who will say that a tall Jewish man in a kippah will come to my rescue, who came to my rescue and told me not to be afraid. Because if we're going to create that coalition of hope, if we're going to break through those stereotypes that we all feel and we're all sometimes encaptured by, if we're going to be partners with the God of endless possibilities in bringing about a new reality, then stepping out and breaking down those stereotypes and creating that coalition of hope is the only way. And if it seems difficult, and if the road ahead seems so long and challenging, I recall that image in our Talmud, that we're always commanded to look at life and the personal and cosmic levels as two perfectly balanced scales. And you never know what little act you take that seemed irrelevant, pointless, meaningless at the time, whether that will be the act that tips those scales one way or the other. That's a challenge, that's a burden, because you can never spend one waking moment not thinking about which side your actions are going to tip those scales on. But it's also the promise. And so my hope and wish and prayer and blessing for all of us, whether it be the Middle East or any of the other spheres of our personal and public and spiritual lives, is that we should always have the wisdom and the courage and the faith to tip those scales in the right direction. Thank you.